Section 4, 1868 to 1963. Chapter 15, Battle of the Black Brains. This is a reminder. This is not a history book, but there are some names in this story that you've read in history books. Names you know, at least names you should know. It's okay if you don't know them because that's what this history book is for, but I'm sure you know this one because his name definitely comes up every February. William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, or as he was known when he was younger, Willie Du Bois, or as he was known when he was older, W.E.B. Du Bois, because nicknames are awesome when you have four names. He and his brother were raised in Massachusetts by a single mother who struggled to take care of them. Young Willie was hit with his first racial experience on an interracial playground when he was 10 years old. In the same way many of us experience our first racial experiences, a girl refused a card from him. Okay, maybe this isn't the first racial experience for a lot of us, but a lot of us have experienced and will experience this kind of rejection. Some of us will experience it romantically. She, he, they just aren't into you. And others of us will, like Du Bois, experience it as a direct result of our differences. In his case, his biggest difference was the color of his skin. That's all he needed to begin competing with his white classmates, determined to convince them that he was not different. And if he was different, it was because he was better. W.E.B. Du Bois didn't know it at 10 years old, but he was going to become the king of uplift suasion. The king of I can do anything they can do. The king of if I'm like you, will you love me? Making him, without a doubt, the black king of assimilation. At least for a while, but we'll get to all that. For now, let's get into how Du Bois, as a teenager, decided, like Phyllis Wheatley, a few generations before him, that he wanted to go to Harvard, all-white Harvard. But of course, that wasn't an option. So the townspeople, good white folks, pooled their money and sent Willie to Fisk University in Nashville, the best black school in the country and the top of the top when it came to teaching black people uplift suasion. Du Bois gobbled up the lessons on how to win white people over, and after his time at Fisk, Du Bois was able to put what he'd learned about assimilationism into practice. His dream had come true. He got into Harvard to earn a postgraduate degree. But not only did he get in, he did so well there that he even spoke at his graduation. W.E.B. Du Bois had graduated from the best black school and the best white school, proving the capabilities of black people, at least in his own mind. Like I said, he was obsessed with keeping up with white people, running their race. But in his speech, he gave credit to Jefferson Davis, saying that the Confederate president represented some kind of rugged individualism as opposed to the submissive nature of the slave. Yikes. Just as John Cotton and Richard Mather had planned several generations before, these ideas were coming out of Du Bois's Ivy League classrooms, where he'd basically been fed the same narrative that black people had been ruined by slavery, that they were irredeemable, in desperate need of fixing, but unfortunately unfixable, which meant he was obviously exceptional and an exception. But the root of his exceptionalism, his excellence, came from his being biracial. It must have. According to one of Du Bois's intellectual mentors, mulattoes were practically the same as any white man. Du Bois went so far as to blame black people for being mistreated, blamed them for fighting back, which meant he blamed them for being lynched. For instance, when white people challenged the 15th Amendment, the right to vote, by attaching an educational qualification to what was supposed to be a freedom for all, Du Bois, an educated man, found fault in the black rage and found justification in the white response to the black rage, because black people were breaking the law by wanting white people to stop breaking the law, that they were wrong for wanting to live. And Du Bois wasn't the only black man who believed that black men were bad. Booker T. Washington, the shining star of Tuskegee Institute, a college that cranked out black brilliance, believed this, and even a dying Frederick Douglass did. As a matter of fact, it took a young anti-racist black woman to set these racist men straight. Ida B. Wells Barnett was an investigative journalist who did the necessary research to expose the inconsistencies in the data. In a pamphlet she published in 1892 called Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases, she found that from a sampling of 728 lynching reports, only a third of black men lynched had actually ever been charged with rape, to say nothing of those who were innocent of the charge. White men were lying about black-on-white rape and hiding their own assaults of black women. But the accusation of rape could make it easier for Southern white men to puff up and act maliciously, all in the name of defending the honor of white women. And Du Bois didn't challenge it. Do the crime, do the time. Don't do the crime, die. I know, W.E.B. Du Bois doesn't really sound that awesome. So let's talk about someone else. Booker T. Washington. Strike the thing I just said about him a few lines up. Actually, don't strike it because it's true. But there's more. Booker T. Washington wanted blacks to focus on what would now be called blue-collar work. While Du Bois was rubbing elbows in the halls of the White Academy, Washington was in the fields. Well, not really. Though he was the head of Tuskegee, his push for civil rights was more of a backdoor approach. After Frederick Douglass's death in 1895, Washington stepped into his place as the new leader of Black America. And though privately he supported empowerment, what he advised was that Black people publicly focus on lower pursuits such as tending the fields, labor, common work, because he knew that would be more acceptable to white people, knew that they would eat it up. Why wouldn't they? A black man saying post-slavery that black people should be happy with the bottom because at least the bottom is a dignified start. For white people, that sounded perfect because it meant there was a greater chance black people would stay out of positions of power and therefore would never actually have any. Oof, I guess Booker T. Washington really doesn't sound that great either. Du Bois believed in being like white people to eliminate threats so that black people could compete. Washington believed in eliminating thoughts of competition so that white people wouldn't be threatened by black sustainability. And there were black people who believed both men because, though we're critiquing their assimilationist ideas in this moment, they were thought leaders of their time. The wildest part about these two men is that they didn't get along. They were like the Biggie and Tupac of their day, or maybe Michael Jackson and Prince. Maybe Malcolm and Martin. They believed in the destination, which was black freedom, but regarding the journey there, they couldn't have disagreed more. Du Bois, the hyper-intellectual golden child, Washington, the man of the people. Du Bois wrote The Souls of Black Folk, which intellectualized who black people really were. Washington wrote Up from Slavery, which outlined the diligence, faith, and fortitude it took and takes to survive in America, coupled with the idea of the white savior. Stories featuring white people having anti-racist epiphanies or moments of empathy resulting in the saving of black people, white savior stories, were becoming a fixture in American media. And the problem with them wasn't that there weren't any good white people in real life. It's that the stories gave the illusion that there were more than there really were. That white people in general were, once again, the saviors of black people. Because of that, partially, Up from Slavery was a hit, and Du Bois couldn't take it. He couldn't stomach the fact that Washington was in the spotlight, shining. Washington was even invited to the White House once Theodore Roosevelt got into office. While the always sophisticated Du Bois publicly critiqued Washington, calling him old-fashioned for being so accommodating to white people, for presenting the idea that black people should find dignity through work and that no education was complete without learning of a trade. Meanwhile, his own book, The Souls of Black Folk, set out to establish the mere fact that black people were complex human beings. It was in this work that Du Bois introduced the idea of double consciousness, a two-ness, a self that is black and a self that is American. And from this, he fashioned a sample set of black people who sat at the converging point. Black people to be positive representatives of the race, Like if blackness, good blackness, was a brand, Du Bois wanted these black people to be the ambassadors of that brand. 1 in every 10 he believed were worthy of the job. He called them the talented 10th. Though Du Bois was against accommodating white people, at least that's what he criticized Washington for, he was still the same man fighting for white approval. He still believed that he could think and dress and speak racism away. No matter what he said about Washington's antics and accommodation, W.E.B. Du Bois was, in fact, still the emperor of uplift suasion. But Du Bois would get a wake-up call, a slap in the face even, not from Washington, but from a man named Franz Boas, who had immigrated to America from Germany in 1886 because of anti-Jewish persecution. Boas had become one of America's most prominent anthropologists and had been drawing similarities between the way his people were mistreated in Germany and the way Black people were being mistreated in America, with each nation justifying the treatment by saying the persecuted group was naturally inferior. Same story, different book. But in 1906, when Du Bois asked Boas to come speak at Atlanta University, where he was teaching, he had no idea what he was in for. Boas affirmed that the idea that Black people are naturally inferior, or even that they've been made inferior from slavery, was false. And all one needed to do to prove this was dig through the history of Black people before they got to America. Black people had a history, and that history, an African history, wasn't one of inferiority. Instead, it was one full of glorious empires like those of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, full of intellects and innovators. Du Bois's head blew right off his shoulders. At least that's the way I imagine it. Either way, his mind and all the white mumbo-jumbo he'd consumed had started to change. But the intellectual high wouldn't last, because by the end of that same year, Black people helped the Republicans regain the House of Representatives in the midterm elections, and as soon as they did, Roosevelt, the president who'd invited Booker T. Washington to his house, the most popular president among Black people ever, kicked a bunch of Black soldiers out of the army without any money. 167 soldiers to be exact. A dozen of them had been falsely accused of murdering a bartender and wounding a cop in Texas. These soldiers of the 25th Infantry Regiment were a point of pride for Black America. For them to be mistreated as fighters for a country that had been fighting against them their entire lives was a blow to the Black psyche. And just like that, Roosevelt was seen as a backstabber by Black people. And because Booker T. Washington was Roosevelt's guy, his man, his Black friend, Washington also had to feel the wrath when the president hurt his people. Due to the social blow Booker T. Washington took because of his familiar and friendly history with Roosevelt, Du Bois's talented 10th rose in influence. Chapter 16, Jack Johnson versus Tarzan. The fighting between Du Bois and Washington was nothing compared with the actual boxing that gripped the entire nation. Black people used Black fighters as a way to symbolically beat on white America's racism. White people used white fighters to prove superiority over Black people in the ring and therefore in the world. No boxer broke the backs of white people and puffed up the chests of Black people like Jack Johnson. He was the most famous Black man in America and the most hated because he was the best. He'd beaten the brakes off every white boxer, and in December 1908, he finally got a shot at the heavyweight title. His opponent, Tommy Burns. The fight took place in Australia, and well, let's just say Jack left Tommy down under. I know, bad joke. A dad joke. A bad dad joke. But still, a fact. For racists, athletes and entertainers could be spun into narratives of the Black aggressor, the natural dancer, etc. Like, the reason Black people were good wasn't because of practice and hard work, but because they were born with it. Note, Black assimilationists have also made this argument, which is racist. It gave white people a way to explain away their own failures, their competitive losses, also gave them justification to find ways to cheat, inside the arena or outside. For Black people, however, sports and entertainment were and still are a way to step into the shoes of the big timer. It was a way to use the athlete or the entertainer, Johnson being both, as an avatar, as a representative of the entire race, like human teleportation machines, zapping Black people, especially poor Black people, from powerlessness to possibility. So if Johnson arrived on the scene dressed in fancy clothes, hands adorned with diamonds, all Black people were psychologically dressed to the nines, at least for a while. If Johnson talked slick to white men, saying whatever he wanted, all Black people got away with a verbal jab or two in their minds. And most important, if Johnson knocked out a white man, guess what? All Black people knocked out a white man. And white people couldn't have that. Immediately, white people started to cry out for a great white hope to beat Johnson. That hope was a retired heavyweight champion, James J. Jeffries. Retired. Their hope was someone who had already quit the sport. Really, I mean, come on. No need to build suspense. You know what happened. Jeffries lost too. And though this was a big deal, especially for white people, it was everything else about Jack Johnson, not just his fighting, that set off alarms in the racist world. One, his ego. Jack Johnson was a champ who acted like a champ. Fur coats and diamonds, an early god of flash. And two, the biggest spike in the heart of white America, Jack Johnson's wife was white. Cue the dramatic organ, or the gunshots, or the thundercrack, or the hissing cat, or... Johnson had too much power. Power to defeat white men, power to be with white women, and just like with the Haitian Revolution, white people were afraid all Black men would feel just as powerful, and that was a no-go. So they figured out a way to get rid of Jack Johnson, to stop him. They arrested him on trumped-up charges for trafficking a prostitute, or rather a white woman, across state lines. He ran, spent 7 years out of the country before turning himself in and doing a year in jail. But the end of Jack Johnson still wasn't enough to make white men feel good about themselves. So a man named Edgar Rice Burroughs wrote a book to reinforce the idea of white supremacy and to remind white men that Africans, Black people, were savages. It was called Tarzan of the Apes. Here's the basic plot of the book series. 1. A white child named John Clayton is orphaned in Central Africa. 2. John is raised by apes. 3. They change his name to Tarzan, which means white skin. 4. Tarzan becomes the best hunter and warrior, better than all the Africans. 5. Eventually he teaches himself to read. 6. In the sequels and subsequent stories, Tarzan protects a white woman named Jane from being ravished by Africans. 7. Tarzan protects a white woman named Jane from being ravished by Africans. 8. Tarzan protects a white woman named Jane from being ravished by Africans. 9. Get it? Tarzan was bigger than Jack Johnson ever was or would be. He became a cultural phenomenon, made into comic strips, movies, television shows, even toys. I'm sure some of you have seen the movies or the old TV shows in which Tarzan does that yodel, a call of white masculinity that we've all mimicked as children. At least I did. Chapter 17, Birth of a Nation and a Nuisance. The same year the first Tarzan novel was published, Black people got tricked again by a political candidate. They helped to get the Democrat Woodrow Wilson elected. Now seems like a good time to address the whole Republican-Democrat thing. At this point in history, the Democrats dominated the South. They were opposed to the expansion of civil rights and anything that had to do with far-reaching federal power, like railroads, settling the West with homesteaders and not slave owners, even state university systems. Today, we'd say they were against big government. Republicans at this time dominated the North. They were for civil rights, at least politically, and wanted expansion and railroads and even a state university system. I know, it feels like I got that description mixed up. Like we're living in backward land? Maybe we are. Anyway, back to Woodrow Wilson. He was a Democrat, and during his first term, he let Black people know that he thought about them by enjoying the first ever film screening in the White House of Hollywood's first blockbuster film, D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation. The film was based on a book called The Klansman. Can you guess what this movie was about? Here's the basic plot. Number one, a black man, named by a white man in blackface, played by a white man in blackface, tries to rape a white woman. 2, she jumps off a cliff and kills herself. 3, Klansmen avenge her death. 4, the end. The beginning of a new outrage. I want to be clear here. Rape isn't something to be taken lightly or to be turned back on the victim as a sharp blade of blame. But during this time, allegations of rape were often used as an excuse to lynch Black men, rooted in the stereotype of the savagery of the Black man and the preciousness of the white woman. Black people protested the movie. The intellects, like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, fought in their intellectual ways, writing. But Southern Black activists did much more. They protested with their feet. It was time to go. It's important to note that this was during the Great War, also known as World War I, but the Great War at home between Blacks and whites had pushed Blacks to the brink. Black people started to leave the South in droves. Imagine the biggest parade you've ever seen and then multiply it by a bazillion, but it didn't look as uniform or as happy. This was a parade of progress. One of hope after severe exhaustion. Black people were tired of being lied to, tired of being told life was better after emancipation, as if Jim Crow laws hadn't made their lives miserable, as if politicians hadn't taken advantage of them, milking them for votes to gain power, only to slap back Black people back down, as if the media hadn't continued to push racist narratives that would put Black people's lives at risk, off page and off screen.